It's strange to be here, he says. The entire city is now a ghost town.
Welcome to Watch Mojo. Today we're looking at disasters that played a pivotal role in human history. For our criteria, we're excluding all deliberate disasters, such as terrorism.
It was almost surreal. The dust. There's nowhere you can run.
The Challenger space shuttle disaster.
Looks like a couple of the solid rocket boosters blew away from the side of the shuttle in an explosion.
NASA suffered repeated delays when attempting to launch the Challenger. Eventually, they grew tired and forced a launch in less than ideal conditions. On board was schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe, who brought Challenger significant media attention. As such, they felt more pressure than usual to launch.
There was a sense of relief that the much-delayed flight was finally underway.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
Morton Thiokol engineers warned NASA about the dangers of launching in cold temperatures, which they decided to ignore. This decision proved to be one of the largest mistakes in space travel. The engineers' worst fears came true. The shuttle exploded horrifically, with no survivors. Since then, space agencies have learned to be as cautious as possible and never to ignore their engineers' warnings.
Then the bland, chilling report.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
San Francisco earthquake.
Most of the city at that time was wood frame construction, but there were some steel frame buildings. And so the earthquake did a lot of damage across the city, but of course most of the damage was actually due to the fire that then followed the earthquake.
America's Pacific coast is right on the border between two tectonic plates. This makes it a region highly susceptible to earthquakes. The most devastating came in 1906, primarily affecting San Francisco. To this day, it remains California's deadliest natural disaster. Around 3,000 tragically lost their lives, and 80% of the city was destroyed. Its primary impact on history was motivating stricter building codes across the country, especially in areas susceptible to earthquakes. It caused major advances in earthquake science, like elastic rebound theory, which was discovered by directly studying the event. Titanic.
Music to drown, boy. Now I know I'm in first class.
Before sailing, its creators were convinced the ship was unsinkable. This hubris led to overconfidence, safety oversights, and poor decision-making, causing one of humanity's worst maritime disasters. It was equipped with lifeboats for about half the passengers, with a crew poorly trained in disaster protocol.
It takes less than 60 seconds to seal Titanic's fate and doom the thousands of lives on board.
It was a tragic example of the disastrous consequences of excessive arrogance. On the bright side, humans began to take maritime safety seriously. They applied this knowledge to HMHS Britannic, Titanic's sister ship. This ship was equipped with enough lifeboats for everyone, but it would ultimately suffer a similar fate, sinking in the Aegean in 1916. This was because of a German mine, though, a much harder disaster to avoid.
Abandon ship! Every man for himself!
The Great Fire of London.
The heat would have been unbearable, and over the ever-present sound of flames, you'd have been able to hear the screams of terrified residents.
In 1665, the bubonic plague returned to London for one last fight. In 18 months, it killed approximately 25% of the city's population. Things got worse for Londoners in 1666, when a tremendous fire destroyed most of the city. Surprisingly few people died, but more than 10,000 buildings were destroyed.
Order them to stand their ground. The fire must not reach the tower. Sir. If the pumps don't reach that far, then we will beat it out. All will be brought to heaven.
Estimates claim it did roughly 10 million pounds of damage, equivalent to over 2 billion pounds today. One consequence of the disaster was the first ever insurance company, the Fire Office. They employed watermen to put out fires, if you paid a fee, of course. Additionally, London was rebuilt with extra care taken to reduce the risks of fire.
The fire spreading quite quickly, as are the rumors that it was started by Dutch spies.
Spies is the Dutch spies, I'm telling you.
The Dust Bowl.
In Garden City, Kansas, the local hardware store sold out of goggles. Then the train delivering a new supply was delayed by a dust storm.
The Great Depression was a time of severe economic crisis for the world. It was primarily caused by the stock market crash of 1929, but a few years later, the Dust Bowl would make things even worse. The 1920s was a period of immense wealth where millions of acres were turned into farmland. It was an agricultural boom, which caused excessive farming that damaged the soil's natural structure.
Widespread drought and dust storms of unprecedented magnitude gripped the West.
This meant that high winds caused humongous dust storms. Farms were quickly turned into deserts, displacing millions. The Depression was a man-made disaster, exacerbated by nature. We learned to shift our farming techniques, focusing on sustainable agriculture, which has thankfully prevented a repeat of the disaster.
This wind-driven dust, fine as the finest flower, penetrates wherever air can go.
Pompeii. In the 1st century, the city of Pompeii was wiped off the map by Mount Vesuvius. It stunned the Romans, who opted to abandon the area for generations. Its short-term effects were significant, setting a precedent for disaster responses. In the long term, it became more monumental.
If I was lucky and I was strong, I could have clambered up to the top of that layer, but then suddenly the surge, the pyroclastic flow, would have just swept me off my feet, and that would have been the end of me.
This is because it was preserved amazingly well by ash, giving us a snapshot of Roman life. For archaeologists, it's a treasure trove of information and has taught us tons. Fascinatingly, it's also arguably the first natural disaster we have an eyewitness account of. These are 2 letters sent by Pliny the Younger, who described the eruption in terrifying detail. Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster.
These spent fuel rods were still highly radioactive. If the pools boiled dry, they could catch fire, and the contamination could be even worse than from a reactor meltdown.
In 2011, Japan experienced the most devastating nuclear disaster this century. There were reportedly few, if any, direct deaths, but at least 160,000 residents were displaced, and few have moved back. It had a severe consequence, with the global attitude towards nuclear energy becoming largely negative. This is unfortunate, since newer thorium reactors are exceedingly safe.
So the rusty steel frames of the structure.
That's the original structure where it was blown off by the hydrogen explosion.
Additionally, they create minimal waste, making them appealing, eco-friendly energy sources. For example, Germany has begun phasing out nuclear energy. China and India went in the other direction, with the Fukushima disaster convincing them to invest in safer types of reactors. Hopefully, these endeavors will be successful, which will cause a golden age for safe, environmentally friendly nuclear power.
More than 400 are dead, almost 1,000 still missing.
Entire neighborhoods are underwater, and the world watches as 2 nuclear reactors remain dangerously unstable.
The Irish Famine.
I saw whole tracts of potato growth changed in one night, from smiling luxuriance to a shriveled and blackened waste.
If you know an Irish person, they have an above-average chance of having hemochromatosis, also known as iron overload. People with it have more iron in their body than usual, a beneficial trait during a famine. This is only one of the many effects the Irish Famine had, a famine caused by infected potato crops. At least 1 million died, and almost twice that amount emigrated, many to America. Before the famine, 8 million people lived in Ireland. Currently, that number sits around 5 million, showing Ireland has never completely recovered from the catastrophe. It also fueled Irish nationalism, with Britain's lackluster response intensifying resentment. Some historians even consider it a genocide, but others argue it was simply neglect.
Even today, in the 21st century, Ireland has still not returned to the population levels of 1845.
The Chernobyl disaster.
The disaster was sparked by massive explosions that tore the roof off of Chernobyl's reactor number 4, spewing radioactive dust into the atmosphere.
Many consider the Chernobyl disaster to have been the most devastating nuclear accident in history. In 1986, the nuclear reactor failed, a meltdown that caused at least 30 deaths and the evacuation of at least 68,000 people. There were major design flaws in the reactor, but it was primarily caused by human error.
The fire in Chernobyl's reactor number 4 was more radioactive than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, potentially deadly even today.
A safety test was conducted during the night by operators with insufficient training. The Soviet Union tried its best to cover it up, partially leading to Gorbachev's glasnost policy, which increased government transparency. While it wasn't the direct cause of the Soviet Union's fall, it contributed heavily. It also massively shifted public opinion on nuclear power.
There is no core. It exploded. The core exploded.
He's in shock. Get him out of here.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. The Black Death.
At that point, none of them knew that they were suffering from the most devastating disease in history, bubonic plague.
Perhaps 50% of the population of Europe died during the 14th century plague pandemic. It was initially carried by fleas living on rats. With little to no understanding of that fact, it decimated Europe. This immense death caused a severe labor shortage, which in turn caused food shortages. It weakened the power of feudal lords, shifting the balance of power from landowners to workers. Survivors bargained for better living conditions, higher wages, and more freedom.
700 years ago, fleas and rats were everywhere. They were part of daily life, and no one connected them to the disease, so no attempt was made to stop them.
This shift also allowed the merchant class to grow, causing an increase in trade and industry in towns. Commerce was more valuable than land ownership, encouraging a consumer economy, and thus the rise of capitalism. So without this pandemic, feudalism may have stuck around for longer.
Few escape with the death of but one or two. Never did so many husbands and wives die together. Never did so many parents carry their children with them to the grave.
Which disaster do you believe had the most profound effects on humanity's trajectory? Let us know in the comments. Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.